blood tasted like copper and old iron. Maeve swallowed it down, ignoring the slick, awful warmth pooling in her left boot. Around her, the great hall roared with the pounding of iron tankards and the feral stench of wet fur. Tonight was the Alpha King's coronation, a night designed to project unbroken strength. Nobody was supposed to bleed, but as her vision narrowed to a dark, fuzzy pinprick, her knees finally hit the stone. The roaring stopped, and then the king fell with her. Smoke clung to everything in the lower levels of Oakhaven Keep. It nested in Maeve's unwashed hair, wove itself into the coarse grey wool of her serving tunic, and sat thick and bitter at the back of her throat. She leaned against the cold, damp stone of the kitchen wall, sucking in shallow breaths. Deep breaths pulled at the stitches. "You're lagging, Maeve." Greta, the head cook, walked past without looking, her massive forearms coated in flour and rendered pork fat. The kitchen was a localized hell of boiling kettles and roasting spits. 300 wolves were upstairs, waiting to gorge themselves in honor of their new king. Maeve didn't answer. She couldn't. She pressed her elbow tight against her ribs, trying to create pressure. 3 days ago, a lesser alpha from a visiting territory had taken offense to how slowly she poured his wine. He hadn't used his claws. That would have been a formal disciplinary action, requiring paperwork. He had just used a heavy leather riding crop, cracking it across her ribs with enough force to split the skin through her thin dress. Being unranked meant you healed like a human, slowly, messily. Now, the wound was weeping. She could smell it beneath the sharp tang of the lye soap she'd scrubbed herself with, a sweet, sickly scent of infection that made her stomach turn. "Grab the cider," Greta barked, finally pausing to scowl at her. "The heavy pitchers. The high table is dry." Maeve nodded once. She pushed off the wall. The movement sent a hot, white spike of agony radiating from her side, up into her jaw. She bit the inside of her cheek until she tasted blood, using the sharp pain to ground herself against the dull, throbbing fever in her body. She didn't feel brave. She felt resentful, exhausted, and desperately thirsty. If she refused to work the ceremony, she would be thrown out of the keep into the autumn freeze. Without a pack to claim her, an unranked female wouldn't last a week in the northern woods. She shuffled toward the massive oak tables where the iron-banded pitchers waited. They held 2 gallons each. Condensation beaded on the outside of the clay. "Here." A smaller, dirt-smudged hand slid a scrap of relatively clean linen towards her over the cutting board. It was Toby, one of the spit boys. He didn't look at her, keeping his eyes fixed on the dripping carcass of a boar. "You're leaking." Maeve glanced down. A dark, wet stain was spreading near the hem of her apron, just below her ribs. Panic, cold and thin, spiked in her chest. Wolves had a sense of smell that defied logic, and the upper floors were packed with apex predators. Blood in the Great Hall, especially tonight, was an insult. It signaled weakness. It invited a challenge. "Thanks," she rasped. Her voice sounded like dry leaves. She turned her back to the bustling room, untied the heavy apron, and shoved the folded linen down the waist of her skirt, pressing it hard against the weeping gash. The coarse fabric bit into the open flesh. She stifled a pathetic whimper, letting out a long, trembling exhale instead. It wasn't enough. The bandage was a delay, not a fix. She grabbed the handles of the 2 clay pitchers. The weight of them immediately pulled at her torn, oblique muscles. Her knees gave a violent, involuntary shake. "Just to the high table and back," she told herself. "Pour the cider. Keep your head down. Don't look at the king. Come back down, crawl under the stairs, and sleep." The stone steps leading up to the great hall were slick with grease and spilled beer. The noise grew louder with every step. It wasn't the civilized murmuring of a human court. It was a physical force. Deep, rumbling laughter that vibrated in Maeve's chest cavity. The cracking of marrow bones, the heavy thud of boots. She reached the heavy iron-bound doors. 2 guards, towering brutes wearing boiled leather and fresh scars, shoved the doors open for the servants. The heat of the room hit Maeve like a physical blow. A massive hearth blazed at both ends of the hall, throwing erratic, leaping shadows across the high vaulted ceiling. Hundreds of faces, flushed with alcohol and meat, lined the long wooden tables. The air was a suffocating soup of scents: wet dog, expensive perfumes, roasted garlic, stale sweat, and the sharp, metallic tang of dominance. Her fever spiked in the overwhelming warmth. Sweat broke out across her forehead, instantly cooling in the draught from the high windows. She kept her chin tucked to her chest, her eyes focused strictly on the grey flagstones beneath her boots. Walk. Pour. Leave. She navigated the narrow aisles between the benches. Hands reached out, casually shoving her out of the way or grabbing at the pitchers. She held tight, letting the momentum carry her forward rather than fighting it. Fighting required muscles that were currently screaming in protest. At the far end of the room sat the high table, elevated on a wooden dais. This was where the visiting alphas sat, the pack elders, and in the center, the heavy carved wooden throne. Maeve didn't want to look up. She really didn't. But as she neared the dais, a sudden heavy silence rippled outward from the center of the room. It wasn't a respectful quiet. It was the tense, suffocating stillness of prey, realizing a predator has entered the clearing. She stopped, the heavy pitchers dragging her shoulders down, and raised her eyes. Rhys, the newly crowned Alpha King of the Northern Territories, did not look majestic. He looked like a man who had just spent 3 months butchering his way across the frozen steppes, which, factually, he had. He slumped in the massive carved chair, an elbow resting on the armrest, his chin propped on a scarred, dirt-ingrained fist. He wore no crown, only a heavy mantle of black wolf fur over a tunic of dark, hardened leather. His hair was black, cropped roughly and sticking up in odd directions, slick with sweat and rain. But it was his eyes that forced the room into silence. They were a pale, startling amber, glowing with an unnatural, ambient light in the dim hall. He wasn't surveying his subjects with pride. He looked at them the way a butcher looks at a flock of sheep, calculating, bored, and mildly irritated by the noise. Maeve felt a strange jolt in her chest. Not awe, not the flutter of some romantic fantasy. It was a deep, primal warning bell. Her nervous system recognized a threat so absolute that her body momentarily forgot the pain in her side. The scent of him finally reached her, cutting through the garlic and sweat of the hall. It was jarring. Ozone, like the air right before a lightning strike, mixed with the harsh, astringent smell of crushed pine needles and something darker underneath. Something ancient and cold. It made Maeve's stomach heave. Her knees trembled again, harder this time. The linen pressed against her wound was completely saturated. She could feel the thick, warm liquid beginning its slow drag down her thigh. "Move!" her brain screamed. "Just pour the damn cider." She forced her feet toward the dais. The elders were speaking now, standing one by one to offer their blood oaths to the new king. A silver bowl was being passed around. Each alpha sliced their palm, letting their blood drip into the vessel, a symbol of fealty. Maeve reached the right side of the high table. An elder, a heavily jowled man whose breath smelled of rotting teeth, shoved his empty tankard toward her. She lifted the clay pitcher. Her right arm shook violently. The heavy vessel wobbled, clinking loudly against the rim of the tankard. The noise was deafening in the relatively quiet hall. The elder turned his massive head, his eyes narrowing. "Watch your hands, cur," he snapped quietly, his upper lip twitching to reveal a lengthened canine. "Apologies, my lord," Maeve whispered, her throat closing. She managed to tip the pitcher, the amber liquid splashing into the iron cup. In the center of the table, Rhys shifted. The movement was subtle, just a slight turn of his broad shoulders, but it drew the eyes of everyone on the dais. He had stopped looking at the alpha currently bleeding into the silver bowl. He was looking to his right. Maeve felt the weight of that gaze before she actually saw it. The hairs on her arms stood straight up. The air around her seemed to thin out, making it hard to draw a breath. She risked a sideways glance through her tangled hair. Rhys was staring directly at her. His amber eyes were slightly wide, the pupils expanding rapidly, bleeding into the gold until his eyes looked almost entirely black. His nostrils flared once, twice, taking in the air. He gripped the carved wooden armrests of his throne. The wood groaned under the sudden, immense pressure. Maeve froze. The pitcher in her hand hung suspended over the elder's cup. Did she spill it? Had she offended him? The pain in her side flared, hot and demanding, pulling her focus back to her failing body. The fever was roaring in her ears now, a sound like a distant ocean. The elder sitting next to Maeve noticed the king's distraction. He sniffed the air, frowning. Then his eyes snapped to Maeve. "You're bleeding!" The elder hissed, his voice dropping into a guttural growl. To a wolf, hidden blood was deceit. It was a sickness brought into a sacred space. "Get out. You're polluting the ceremony." He backhanded her. It wasn't a full-strength blow, just a dismissive swat meant to clear her from his space. But he hit her right side, right on the weeping, infected lash mark. The impact didn't just hurt, it detonated. The fragile stitches tore free with a sickening pop. The crude linen bandage shifted, useless. Maeve stumbled backward. The heavy clay pitcher slipped from her slick fingers. It hit the flagstones with a sharp crack, exploding into shards of pottery and a tidal wave of sticky cider. The entire hall went dead silent. The music stopped. The murmuring ceased. The only sound was the dripping of cider off the edge of the dais, and Maeve's ragged, wet gasps for air. She stood there for one agonizing second. The room spun wildly. The high rafters blurred into a dark, swirling canopy. The smell of her own blood, copper, rust, and the sickly sweet rot of infection blossomed into the air, completely unhidden now. It drowned out the garlic. It drowned out the wet fur. "I'm going to be killed," she thought. It was a very calm, practical thought. "He's going to come down here and rip my throat out for ruining the oath." Her legs simply ceased to function. The muscle memory of walking, of standing, evaporated. Maeve collapsed. She didn't fall gracefully. She crumpled, a heap of cheap grey wool and sharp angles, landing hard on her hip, right in the puddle of spilled cider and broken clay. She curled inward instantly, a defensive ball, wrapping her arms around her bleeding side, waiting for the killing blow. The silence stretched. It was a heavy, suffocating thing, pressing down on the back of Maeve's neck. She kept her eyes squeezed shut, her face pressed against the cold, damp stone. She could feel the cider soaking through her dress, mixing with the hot, steady flow of her own blood. "Do it quickly," she prayed to no one in particular. "Just snap the neck. Don't let them drag me outside first." But the attack didn't come. Instead, a chair scraped violently against the wooden dais above her. It was followed by a heavy thud, the sound of a massive body landing on the flagstones. A collective gasp ripped through the great hall. It wasn't a gasp of anger. It was a sound of profound, collective shock. Maeve opened one eye, peering through the tangled curtain of her hair. Boots. Heavy, steel-toed leather boots, caked in dried mud and frost, stood inches from her face. She stopped breathing. The ozone and pine resin scent was so thick now, it felt like it was coating the inside of her lungs. The king. He had stepped off the dais. He had abandoned the sacred blood oath ceremony, leaving the elders standing with sliced palms. She braced for the kick. She squeezed her eyes shut again, waiting for the heavy steel toe to crash into her ribs. Instead, the enormous presence suddenly dropped. The sound of his knees hitting the stone floor echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. Maeve flinched violently, crying out as the movement tore her wound further. She tried to scramble backward, sliding uselessly in the sticky puddle, her palms slipping on wet stone. "Don't!" The voice was a low, gravelly rasp. It didn't sound like a king issuing a command. It sounded frantic. It sounded like a man who had just taken an arrow to the chest and was trying to figure out how to breathe. Maeve froze, her back pressed against the boots of one of the stunned guards. She forced her head up, her vision swimming with fever. Rhys was on his knees. The Alpha King, the conqueror of the Northern Steppes, a man who had made warlords grovel in the mud, was kneeling in a puddle of cheap cider and servants' blood. He wasn't looking at the crowd. He wasn't looking at the elders. He was staring at her. Up close, he was terrifying. His face was a map of old violence, a pale scar cutting through his left eyebrow, a slight crook to his nose. But his expression was completely unhinged. The bored, calculating predator was gone. His amber eyes were blown wide, completely swallowed by black pupils. His chest heaved as if he had just sprinted for miles. He reached out a hand. Maeve shrank back, burying her face into her shoulder, a pathetic whine escaping her throat. "Please," she croaked, the word tearing at her dry throat. "I'm sorry, I'll clean it, please." Rhys froze. His large hand, covered in calluses and dark dirt, hovered in the air just inches from her face. He looked at his own hand as if he didn't recognize it, then looked at her cowering form. A violent shudder racked his massive frame. "Who did this?" he whispered. The words weren't meant for her. They were a question aimed at the universe, laced with a sudden, localized violence that made the ambient temperature in the room seem to drop. He didn't wait for an answer. He lowered his hand, bypassing her face, and reached toward her waist. Maeve panicked. She slapped blindly at his arm, a weak, useless gesture. "No, don't, it's dirty!" He ignored her completely. His massive fingers brushed against her hip. His touch was jarringly gentle. It didn't match the size of him, or the violence in his face. He found the edge of her soaked apron and carefully, with agonizing slowness, pulled the fabric back. The crude, blood-soaked linen shifted, exposing the festering gash across her ribs. The angry red edges of the torn stitches stood out starkly against her pale, dirt-streaked skin. The smell of infection was undeniable now. A low, vibrating growl started in the center of Rhys's chest. It wasn't human. It was the sound of a beast recognizing that something purely theirs had been damaged. The sound rolled outward, hitting the front rows of the great hall. Behind them, an elder finally broke the paralysis. "My king," the man stuttered, stepping to the edge of the dais. "The servant is diseased. Let the guards remove her so we may—" "Shut your mouth." Rhys didn't even look up. He didn't raise his voice. But the command carried a weight so heavy that the elder's jaw snapped shut with an audible click. Several wolves in the front rows instinctively bared their throats, dropping their eyes to the floor. Rhys leaned closer to Maeve. She could feel the heat radiating off him. He was trembling. The king was actually trembling. "Look at me," he commanded, his voice tight, straining against something he was fighting to keep buried. Maeve was crying now. She hated it. She hated that she was weak, that her body was failing, that this massive, terrifying man was staring at her infected wound instead of killing her. She blinked away the hot tears and looked up into his dark, swallowed eyes. I don't understand," she breathed, her teeth chattering from the fever chill. Rhys swallowed hard. He slowly reached up, his large, rough thumb brushing against her cheekbone, wiping away a streak of dirt and a single tear. His skin was burning hot against hers. The touch sent a weird, electric shock straight through her sternum, a sudden, blinding flash of rightness that warred instantly with her deep-seated cynicism. "Neither do I," he murmured, his voice cracking. He leaned his forehead forward until it rested gently against hers. "But you're bleeding, and it feels like I'm the one dying." Without another word, he slid one massive arm under her knees and the other behind her back. He stood up in one fluid motion, lifting her against his chest as easily as if she were a bundle of dry kindling. The pain in her side shifted, but the firm pressure of his arm surprisingly eased the tearing sensation. She instinctively clutched at the thick wolf fur of his mantle, her bloody hand leaving a dark smear on the pelt. Rhys turned, finally facing the stunned, silent hall. "The ceremony," he stated, his voice ringing out cold and hollow, "is over. Bring the healer to my chambers. Now." He didn't wait for obedience. He didn't look back at the throne. He walked straight through the parted sea of silent, terrified predators, carrying a bleeding, unranked scullery maid out of the great hall. Cold draughts whipped through the high stone corridors of Oakhaven Keep. Maeve squeezed her eyes shut, fighting the nausea brought on by the jarring rhythm of Rhys's strides. He walked fast, his heavy boots echoing off the granite walls, carrying her tight against his chest. She felt every shift of his muscles beneath the thick leather tunic. He was a furnace. A massive, terrifying furnace radiating a scent of bruised pine and electricity that made her head swim. She kept her bloody hands clenched tight against her chest, afraid to touch him, afraid to stain him further. She was a scullery maid. He was the Alpha King. This proximity was a death sentence. The elders would demand her head for this insult. They passed through a set of heavy iron-bound oak doors. The abrupt change in temperature was shocking. Rhys's private chambers were suffocatingly warm, heated by a roaring fire in a cavernous stone hearth. The air tasted of wood smoke, old parchment, and the lingering, sharp scent of his wolf. It was a dense, masculine space. There were no tapestries, no soft rugs, just scarred wood, weapons, and a massive, heavy-timbered bed draped in thick furs. Rhys didn't hesitate. He carried her directly to the center of the room and set her down on the edge of the mattress. The mattress sank beneath her. It was stuffed with actual feathers, not the crushed straw and dried leaves she was used to. The sudden, yielding softness sent a spike of pure panic through her. It was wrong. She didn't belong here. Her brain, hardwired for survival in the brutal lower levels, screamed that this was a trap. Predators didn't offer comfort to prey unless they were fattening them up. "Sit," Rhys commanded. His voice was a harsh rasp, completely stripped of its former cold authority. Maeve immediately tried to slide off the bed. "I shouldn't. The blood. I'll ruin the pelts." Rhys stopped her, his large hands clamped onto her shoulders. The grip was shockingly restrained, his thumbs resting against her collarbones. He bent at the waist, bringing his face level with hers. The ambient glow in his amber eyes was erratic, pulsing with a frantic, barely leashed energy. "Let the pelts rot," he growled. It wasn't a threat toward her, it was a curse aimed at the universe. "Stay still. You're losing too much heat." He pulled away abruptly, turning his back to her. He paced toward the fireplace, running a hand aggressively through his dark, sweat-slicked hair. He looked like a caged animal trying to figure out how to break the bars. The chamber doors banged open. Bram, the pack's head healer, stumbled into the room. He was a wiry, older wolf with salt and pepper hair, carrying a heavy leather satchel. He smelled heavily of dried herbs, grain alcohol, and stark, unfiltered fear. He took one look at the king pacing by the fire and swallowed hard. "My king," Bram started, bowing his head. "Fixer." Rhys interrupted. He didn't turn around. He just stared into the flames, his broad shoulders rising and falling with heavy, uneven breaths. Bram hurried over to the bed. He set his satchel on a low wooden trunk and pulled out a clean linen towel, a jar of foul-smelling grey paste, and a curved iron needle. Maeve flinched away as he reached for her. "Hold still, girl," Bram muttered, his voice tight. He wasn't gentle. He had stitched up hundreds of warriors torn apart in territorial skirmishes. He had no bedside manner for a weeping, infected lash mark. He gripped her waist and pulled the soaked, ruined apron away. The crude bandage peeled off with a sickening, tearing sound. Maeve bit down on her lip so hard she tasted fresh copper. The wound was ugly. The elder's careless swat had ripped the original stitches through the inflamed skin, leaving jagged, weeping edges. Bram sighed, a sound of professional irritation. This is a mess. It's festering. Unranked healing speeds are pathetic. He uncorked a glass bottle filled with a clear, harsh-smelling liquid. Brace yourself. This is going to burn. Maeve gripped the edge of the mattress. She knew what was coming. White alcohol. It was used to scorch infection out of deep wounds. She squeezed her eyes shut and locked her jaw. Across the room, a low snarl vibrated against the stone walls. Bram froze, the bottle hovering inches from Maeve's side. He looked back over his shoulder. Rhys had turned away from the fire. His eyes were entirely black now, the amber consumed by the primal, violently protective instincts of his wolf. His lips were pulled back, revealing lengthened, razor-sharp canines. Careful, Rhys warned. The word was a heavy, physical threat. Sire. Bram stammered, his hands shaking slightly. The infection must be burned out. I have to clean it before I re-stitch the tear. It will cause her pain. I cannot avoid it. Rhys took a heavy step forward. The floorboards groaned. He looked at Bram's throat, then down at Maeve's pale, trembling form. The internal war playing out across his scarred face was terrifying to watch. The king knew the healer was right. The wolf wanted to tear the healer to shreds for causing his mate distress. Do it! Rhys finally choked out. He closed the distance between them, ignoring Bram completely. He dropped to one knee beside the bed, positioning himself right in front of Maeve. He reached out and grabbed her right hand. His palm was rough, covered in thick calluses from years of holding broadswords, but his grip was steady. Squeeze, he ordered softly. Maeve stared at him, utterly bewildered. The Alpha King was kneeling again. For her. Now. Bram muttered. He poured the raw alcohol directly into the open gash. The pain was absolute. It wasn't a sting. It was a roaring forest fire erupting beneath her ribs. It consumed her entirely, wiping away her vision, her hearing, her sense of gravity. Maeve didn't scream. She had learned long ago that screaming in the scullery only brought more beatings. Instead, she inhaled sharply, a high, broken hiss, and crushed her fingers around Rhys's hand. She squeezed with every ounce of strength her fever-riddled body possessed. Her nails dug into his skin. Rhys didn't flinch. He leaned closer, his free hand coming up to grip the back of her neck. He pressed her face into the curve of his shoulder, burying her nose into the thick, dark fur of his mantle. I know. He murmured into her hair, his chest rumbling against her cheek. I know. Breathe. Just breathe into me. The scent of him, ozone, pine, and deep, ancient earth, flooded her senses, anchoring her as the white-hot agony tore through her side. She clung to him like a drowning rat clinging to a piece of driftwood. She hated herself for it. She hated how desperately she wanted to bury herself in his warmth, to let him absorb the pain. It went against every cynical survival rule she had ever written for herself. Bram worked quickly, threading the curved iron needle with thick, black gut string. Every pierce of the needle, every pull of the thread, sent fresh shocks of pain through her, but the alcohol had numbed the rawest edges. Through it all, Rhys held her. He didn't speak again. He just absorbed her trembling, his hand wrapped securely around hers, his thumb stroking a slow, repetitive rhythm against her knuckles. It was a stark, jarring contradiction. A warlord offering a servant absolute, unquestioning shelter. Done! Bram finally announced, his voice tight with exhaustion. He tied off the last knot and snipped the gut string. He smeared a thick layer of the grey, foul-smelling paste over the angry red stitches, then wrapped her torso tightly in clean, dry linen strips. Maeve slumped forward, completely drained. The adrenaline crash hit her like a falling anvil. Rhys caught her easily. He shifted her weight, laying her back against the feather pillows. He pulled a thick, heavy wolf pelt up to her chin. "Leave," Rhys told the healer. Bram didn't need to be told twice. He packed his satchel with frantic speed, bowed hastily to the king's back, and practically ran from the room, the heavy oak doors thudding shut behind him. Silence descended on the chamber, broken only by the crackle of the hearth fire and the ragged sound of Maeve's breathing. She stared up at the high, vaulted ceiling, feeling the exhaustion pulling her down into a dark, heavy sleep. Before her eyes drifted shut, she felt a sudden, heavy weight settle on the edge of the mattress. Rhys. He didn't leave. He simply sat beside her, his massive frame a dark silhouette against the firelight, standing guard over a broken scullery maid. Light sliced through the heavy velvet curtains, cutting a sharp, dusty line across the stone floor. Maeve woke up slowly, dragging herself upward through layers of deep, dreamless sleep. Her mouth tasted like old ash. Her side throbbed, a dull, rhythmic ache rather than the sharp, tearing agony of yesterday. She blinked, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. She was still in the enormous bed. The heavy pelt was still tucked firmly around her shoulders. She turned her head. Rhys was sitting in a heavy wooden chair near the fireplace. He wasn't asleep. He was staring at her. He had discarded the thick fur mantle and the heavy leather tunic. He wore only a simple, dark linen shirt, unlaced at the throat, and dark trousers. Without the armor, he looked less like a warlord and more like a deeply exhausted man. Dark circles bruised the skin under his pale, amber eyes. The scar cutting through his eyebrow looked stark white against his flushed skin. He hadn't slept. He had watched her all night. Maeve swallowed hard, trying to generate some moisture in her throat. She pushed herself up on her elbows. The movement pulled at her stiff side, making her wince. Rhys was out of the chair instantly. He crossed the room in 2 long strides, reaching the bedside before she could even register the movement. He held out a heavy silver goblet. "Water," he said. His voice was rough, scraping like sandpaper. Maeve hesitated. She looked at the goblet, then up at his face. The cynical voice in her head, the one that kept her alive, screamed at her to refuse, to demand to go back to the kitchens. This was a dangerous game. She was playing house with a predator. But her thirst was unbearable. She reached out, her fingers trembling slightly, and took the goblet. Their fingers brushed. That strange electric shock zipped up her arm again. It wasn't a pleasant spark. It was a heavy, grounding jolt, like a heavy iron door slamming into a lock. It made her breath hitch. Rhys felt it too. His jaw tightened. He pulled his hand back quickly, clenching it into a fist at his side. Maeve drank the water. It was ice-cold and tasted metallic, but it was the best thing she had ever swallowed. She drained the goblet and set it on the small wooden table beside the bed. "Thank you," she rasped. She pulled the pelt higher around her neck, feeling horribly exposed despite the layers of bandages. "I should go back downstairs. Greta will tan my hide for missing the morning prep." Rhys let out a dark, humorless laugh. It sounded like stones grinding together. "You're not going back to the kitchens?" Maeve frowned. The fear started to creep back in, cold and familiar. "I have to work. I don't have a pack. If I don't work, they throw me out. You have a pack," Rhys said flatly. He turned away from her, walking back toward the fire. He leaned a thick forearm against the stone mantelpiece, staring down into the dying embers. "You have mine." Maeve stared at his broad back. "I don't understand. Don't you?" Rhys turned his head, looking at her over his shoulder. The intense, predatory focus was back in his eyes, but it was mixed with something deeply bitter. "You felt it. Last night in the hall, when you dropped the pitchers, you felt the shift. Maeve's stomach dropped. She remembered the sudden silence, the way the air had thinned out, the heavy pulling sensation in her chest when he had looked at her. "The elders think you used blood magic," Rhys continued, his voice devoid of emotion. "They think you polluted the oath bowl to cast a glamour. They want you interrogated." Panic spiked in her throat. "I didn't. I swear I was just bleeding. The elder hit me. I dropped the cider. I know you didn't." Rhys interrupted. He turned fully toward her, his expression hard. "Because blood magic doesn't do what happened yesterday. Blood magic doesn't make an Alpha King's wolf drop him to his knees in front of 300 territorial warlords." He walked slowly back towards the bed. He didn't sit down. He stood towering over her, a looming wall of muscle and suppressed aggression. "I have spent the last 10 years carving this kingdom out of ice and bone," Rhys said quietly. "I have killed 6 alphas. I have unified the Northern Territories. I was supposed to take a mate from the ruling families to seal the treaties." He leaned closer, resting his hands on the mattress on either side of her hips, trapping her. He brought his face down until they were eye level, and instead, Rhys breathed, the scent of ozone wrapping around her like a physical chain. "The moon goddess decides to tie my soul, my wolf, and my absolute sanity to a bleeding, unranked scullery maid who smells like cheap lye soap and terror." Maeve stopped breathing. The words hung in the air, heavy and impossible. "Mate?" He was claiming they were mates. It wasn't a romantic declaration. It sounded like an accusation. It sounded like a tactical disaster. "I'm broken!" Maeve blurted out. It was the only defense she had. The raw, ugly truth. "I heal slow. I can't shift. I don't have a wolf. If you claim me, the elders will challenge you. They'll say you're weak." Rhys stared at her. For a long, silent moment, he didn't move. The muscle in his jaw ticked. The conflict in him was palpable, the ingrained, brutal politics of the werewolf hierarchy warring against the absolute, unbreakable pull of the mate bond. Then slowly, he reached up. He didn't touch her face this time. He traced a single, calloused finger over the edge of the linen bandage wrapped around her ribs. "Let them challenge." Rhys whispered. The violent promise in his voice sent a shiver straight down Maeve's spine. "I need to kill something today anyway." He straightened up, his towering presence filling the room once more. "You stay here. You eat what they bring you. If anyone besides Bram tries to open those doors, you scream." He turned and walked towards the heavy oak doors. "Where are you going?" Maeve asked, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to sound cynical. Rhys paused with his hand on the iron latch. He didn't look back. "To have a conversation with the elder who struck you," he replied casually. "It's going to be very short." The door opened and closed with a heavy thud, leaving Maeve alone in the massive bed, listening to the crackle of the fire and the terrifying realization that she was no longer invisible. She was the mate of the Alpha King, and in Oakhaven Keep, visibility was the fastest way to get killed. Dust motes danced in the shafts of pale afternoon light, mocking the heavy, suffocating silence of the chamber. Maeve lay rigid against the feather pillows, listening. Beyond the thick oak doors, Oakhaven Keep was eerily quiet. There were no muffled shouts from the kitchens, no clatter of armor from the training yards. The entire fortress felt as though it were holding its breath, waiting for the executioner's axe to fall. Her side throbbed, a steady rhythmic pulse of dull pain that kept her grounded in her own fragile mortality. She carefully pushed the heavy wolf pelt off her chest. The air in the room had cooled, the hearth fire burning down to a pile of glowing orange embers. She needed to move. Lying here like a prized calf in a slaughterhouse pen was driving her insane. Her survival instincts, honed by years of dodging kicks and thrown pots, demanded she find an exit. or at least a weapon. She swung her legs over the edge of the mattress. Her bare feet hit the stone floor. The cold shocked her system, sending a violent shiver up her spine. She stood up, her knees wobbling dangerously. The room tilted. She grabbed the heavy wooden bedpost, waiting for the nausea to pass. The thick linen bandages bound tightly around her ribs restricted her breathing, forcing her to take shallow, rapid gasps. She limped toward the fireplace. Next to the hearth, a heavy iron poker rested against the stone. It wasn't a broadsword, but it was heavy enough to crush a skull if swung with enough desperate momentum. She wrapped her fingers around the cold, textured iron. It felt ridiculous in her trembling grip, a toothpick against a fortress of apex predators, but having it eased the tight coil of panic in her chest just a fraction. Footsteps sounded in the corridor, heavy, deliberate, and entirely alone. Maeve froze, tightening her grip on the iron poker. She pressed her back against the rough stone of the fireplace, hiding in the deepest shadow of the room. The iron latch on the oak doors lifted with a sharp, metallic clack. Rhys walked in. He didn't look like a king returning from a diplomatic dispute. He looked like a butcher at the end of a long, bloody shift. His dark trousers were stained with fresh, wet streaks of crimson. It coated his hands, drying in dark, flaking patches across his knuckles and under his fingernails. A long, dark smear of it marked his jawline, just below the pale scar on his eyebrow. The scent hit the room a second later. It was thick, heavy, and undeniably metallic. It wasn't the smell of a slaughtered animal. It was the sharp, panicked scent of wolf blood. Rhys kicked the heavy door shut behind him. He didn't immediately look for her. He walked to a silver basin sitting on a wooden washstand, his movements stiff and jerky. He poured water from a pitcher, the splashing sound deafening in the quiet room. He plunged his hands into the cold water, scrubbing at the blood with a harsh, abrasive piece of lye soap. Maeve watched him from the shadows, a breath caught in her throat. The poker in her hand suddenly felt 10 times heavier. He had actually done it. He had killed the elder, a seated sworn member of the council, over a scullery maid. "You can put the fire iron down," Rhys said. His voice was completely flat. He didn't turn around. He just kept scrubbing his hands, turning the water in the silver basin a cloudy, sickening pink. "It won't do you any good against what's coming." Maeve lowered the poker. The iron clanged softly against the stone floor. She stepped out of the shadows, her bare feet silent on the flagstones. "You killed him." "I tore his throat out." Rhys corrected her, his tone perfectly conversational, though a dark, bitter edge bled through the words. He grabbed a rough linen towel and dried his hands, wiping aggressively at the smears on his forearms. In the middle of the council room, in front of 36 witnesses, Maeve felt the blood drain from her face. Her knees threatened to buckle again. "Why? Why would you do that? You just handed them a reason to execute you." Rhys finally turned around. He threw the blood-stained towel onto the floor. His amber eyes were exhausted. The predatory glow dimmed to a dull, flickering spark. He looked at her, truly looked at her, taking in the pale, terrified set of her jaw, the way she clutched her wounded side, the desperate, cynical fear swimming in her eyes. "Because he touched what is mine," Rhys said simply. It wasn't a boast. It was a miserable, unavoidable fact. "Because the moment my wolf registered the smell of your infected blood on his hands, diplomacy ceased to be a biological option." He walked slowly towards her. Maeve fought the urge to step backward. He stopped a few feet away, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating off his body, close enough to smell the violent ozone scent completely masking the blood. "I don't want this either," Rhys murmured, his voice dropping to a harsh, gravelly whisper. He ran a hand through his dark, messy hair. "Do you think I asked the goddess for a mate who shatters like glass? A human-blooded, unranked female who requires me to burn down my own alliances just to keep her breathing?" The words stung, hitting her cynical core with perfect accuracy. It was exactly what she had been thinking. She wasn't offended. She was validated. "Then let me go." Maeve shot back, her voice shaking but suddenly furious. "Tell them it was a mistake. Let me run. If you killed him, they are going to come for you. They will tear this keep apart." "They are already coming," Rhys replied, his gaze dropping to the bandages wrapping her ribs. "And I can't let you go. If you leave this room, the pack will rip you to shreds before you make it to the tree line. You carry my scent now. You are marked as the king's weakness." He closed the remaining distance between them. He reached out, his blood-stained fingers hovering just inches from her face. He didn't touch her. He seemed terrified to touch her, as if he knew his hands were meant for ruining things, not protecting them. "We are tethered, Maeve," he said, his voice cracking slightly. It was the first time he had used her name. It sounded strange on his tongue, heavy and deliberate. "The bond is locked. If they kill you, the shock will stop my heart. If they kill me, your mind will snap." Maeve stared up at him. The sheer, overwhelming reality of it crushed the air out of her lungs. She wasn't just a maid anymore. She was a load-bearing pillar in a collapsing kingdom. "So what do we do?" she whispered, her cynicism failing, leaving behind only raw, naked terror. Rhys let his hand fall to his side. The muscles in his jaw locked tight. He looked past her, toward the heavy oak doors, as a low, ominous sound began to vibrate through the stone walls of the keep. It was the sound of howling, not one wolf, but dozens, a chorus of rage and challenge echoing from the lower courtyards. "We bleed," Rhys answered softly. "And we make them bleed more." The howling didn't stop. It swelled into a deafening physical pressure that rattled the iron latches and made the glass panes in the high windows shudder. It was the sound of a pack turning on its alpha. The ancient, brutal mechanism of werewolf justice clicking into gear. Maeve stood frozen by the dead fireplace. The cold of the stone floor seeped into her bones, completely overriding the fever still simmering in her blood. She watched Rhys. He didn't panic. He didn't rush to grab a weapon. He simply walked to the heavy wooden wardrobe in the corner and pulled out a fresh tunic, this one made of boiled leather, studded with iron rivets. Armor. He pulled it over his head, adjusting the heavy leather straps over his broad shoulders. He strapped a wide leather belt around his waist and secured a massive, cross-hilted broadsword to his hip. The metallic shing of the blade settling into the scabbard cut cleanly through the background noise of the howling outside. "They won't come up the stairs yet," Rhys said, his voice entirely devoid of the emotional crack from moments ago. He was compartmentalizing. The warlord was taking over. They will demand a parley first. The remaining elders will want to formally issue the challenge before they try to breach the doors. It's the law. "What happens during a parley?" Maeve asked. Her voice sounded thin and reedy, a pathetic sound in the dense, masculine room. "They stand in the hall. I stand here. They list my crimes against the pack. I reject them. And then—" Rhys paused, his amber eyes completely flat and dead. "They try to kill me." Heavy, synchronized footsteps echoed in the stone corridor outside. The howling in the courtyards died down, replaced by a tense, suffocating silence inside the keep. A dozen sets of boots marched in perfect unison, stopping right outside the heavy oak doors. Maeve's breath caught. She backed up until her shoulders hit the rough stone of the chimney. Thud. 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 Someone struck the door with the heavy iron pommel of a sword. The sound was deafening. "Rhys of the Northern Wastes!" A voice boomed through the thick wood. It was an elder. The tone was laced with raw, unfiltered dominance. "You have spilled sworn blood within the council walls. You have broken the ancient pact. Step forth and face the judgment of the Alphas." Rhys didn't move toward the door immediately. He turned to Maeve. His expression was unreadable, a solid mask of hardened leather and scar tissue. "Get in the wardrobe," he ordered quietly. Maeve blinked. "What? The wardrobe?" Reese repeated, pointing a heavy, gauntleted finger toward the massive oak piece. "It's built into the stone. The wood is iron reinforced. Get inside. Don't make a sound. No matter what you hear happening in this room, do not come out until Bram opens the doors." "But—" Maeve's mind spun. "If they kill you—" "If they kill me, Bram has instructions to smuggle you out through the scullery tunnels." Reese cut her off. His voice was harsh, brooking no argument. "Move, now." He turned his back on her, walking slowly towards the center of the room, positioning himself directly in front of the double doors. He rested his right hand on the hilt of his broadsword. Maeve took a step towards the wardrobe. It was the logical choice. It was the survival choice. Hide. Stay small. Let the predators tear each other to pieces and slip away in the blood-soaked aftermath. It was how she had survived 20 years as an unranked servant. Thud, thud, thud. The pommel struck the door again, splintering the outer layer of oak. "Come out, boy," the elder sneered through the wood. "Or we will burn the doors down and slaughter the human pet you threw your crown away for." Maeve stopped. The words hit her like a physical blow to her wounded ribs. Human pet. She looked at Reese's broad back. He was standing alone. He had conquered the north, unified the packs, and dragged these savage warlords into an era of peace. And he had burned it all to ashes in 5 seconds, because he couldn't stand to see her bleed. He was going to die. He was strong, but there were at least 4 elders outside that door, backed by their elite guards. He was going to be hacked to pieces on the expensive feather mattress, and she was going to cower in a closet listening to him choke on his own blood. A strange, burning sensation ignited in Maeve's chest. It wasn't the fever. It wasn't the dull ache of her stitches. It was anger. A deep, jagged, purely human fury. She was sick of hiding. She was sick of bleeding on dirty floors while these arrogant, overgrown dogs played politics with her life. Reese reached out, his hand wrapping around the heavy iron latch of the double doors. He prepared to pull them open, throwing himself into the hallway to keep the violence out of the chamber. Wait. The word was barely a rasp, but it echoed loudly in the quiet room. Reese froze. He looked over his shoulder. Maeve wasn't moving toward the wardrobe. She was walking toward him. Her bare feet dragged slightly on the stone. Her grey linen dress was wrinkled and stained with old cider and dried blood. Her hair was a tangled, unwashed mess. She looked exactly like what she was, a battered scullery maid. But she didn't stop. She walked right past the heavy wooden chair. She walked past the foot of the massive bed. The pain in her side was excruciating with every step, a hot knife twisting in her ribs. But she gritted her teeth and swallowed the whimper that tried to crawl up her throat. "What are you doing?" Reese hissed, his amber eyes flaring with sudden panicked rage. "Get back in the corner." "No," Maeve said. She reached his side. She didn't look up at him. She stared straight at the splintering oak doors. "Maeve, they will tear you apart." Reese grabbed her arm, trying to physically drag her behind him. She yanked her arm out of his grip. The sudden, violent movement tore a fresh stitch. A warm trickle of fresh blood seeped into the tight linen bandages. She ignored it. She looked up at the massive, terrifying king, her own eyes burning with a cynical, desperate defiance. "If we are tethered," Maeve whispered, her voice trembling but hard as iron, "then act like it. They think I'm a pet. They think I'm a weakness." She reached out. Her small, dirt-smudged hand grasped his massive, leather-clad forearm. The electric shock hit them both, a grounding, violent spark that seemed to anchor the very air in the room. "Open the door, Reese," Maeve commanded. Her voice didn't shake this time. "Let them look at the weakness that brought the Alpha King to his knees." Reese stared down at her. The panic in his eyes slowly receded, replaced by something entirely different. It was awe, a dark, terrifying, absolute reverence. The wolf inside him didn't see a fragile human. It saw a mate standing on the front lines, baring her throat to the teeth of the enemy. A slow, vicious smile spread across Rhys's scarred face. It was the smile of a butcher who had just been handed a very sharp cleaver. "As my queen commands," Rhys murmured. He didn't draw his sword. He didn't brace himself. He simply lifted the heavy iron latch and kicked the double oak doors wide open. The heavy wood slammed against the stone walls with a deafening crash. The hallway was packed. 4 elders, heavily armored and flanked by a dozen massive guards, stood with swords drawn. The smell of their aggressive pheromones was thick enough to choke on. They surged forward instinctively as the doors burst open, their lips pulled back in feral snarls. And then they stopped. They hit an invisible wall of pure, suffocating dominance. Rhys stood in the doorway, his massive frame blocking the light from the chamber. But he wasn't standing in a fighting stance. He was standing casually, his hand resting lightly on the waist of the tiny, battered human female standing beside him. Maeve didn't cower. She didn't hide behind his cape. She stood perfectly straight, leaning slightly into Rhys's side to keep her weight off her torn ribs, and stared dead into the eyes of the lead elder. The silence that fell over the corridor was absolute. It was the heavy, terrifying quiet of a powder keg right before the spark hits. The Alpha King hadn't just broken the law, he had brought the reason right to their doorstep, daring them to do something about it. Torches spit pitch and ash into the drafty corridor, their erratic light catching on the drawn steel of the elders' blades. Maeve stood in the open doorway, the heavy metallic tang of drawn blood thick in the air. The silence was not peaceful. It was the taut, screeching pull of a bowstring drawn back too far. Cormac, the lead elder whose iron-grey hair was plastered to his thick skull with sweat, stared at her. His eyes, completely black with his wolf's surface fury, flicked from Maeve's pale, dirt-streaked face to the possessive grip Rhys held on her waist. The elder's nostrils flared, dragging in the scent of the hallway. He was looking for a weakness. He was looking for the reek of terror. Maeve was terrified. Her knees felt like they were made of damp sand. The throbbing in her ribs was a blinding, hot spike of agony with every shallow breath. But the cynicism that had kept her alive in the scullery, the cold, hard knowledge that showing fear to a starving dog only guaranteed a bite, hardened her spine. She locked her jaw. She didn't drop her eyes. She stared back at Cormac with the exhausted, dead-eyed glare of a woman who had already been bleeding for 3 days. "You shield yourself with a crippled servant, Rhys!" Cormac finally growled, his voice a low, wet rumble that vibrated against the stone floor. He took a heavy half-step forward, his broadsword angled towards the floorboards. "You broke the ancient pact. You slaughtered Elder Garrett at the council table. For what? A piece of unranked meat that won't survive the winter." Rhys didn't yell. He didn't bare his teeth. The terrifying thing about the king was how deeply still he became when he intended to kill. The chaotic, ambient glow in his amber eyes vanished, leaving behind a cold, flat yellow. "Garrett struck what is mine," Rhys replied. His voice was not a roar, it was a devastatingly calm statement of fact. The absolute certainty in his tone made 2 of the heavily armored guards behind Cormac shift uneasily. "He polluted the oath. He insulted the crown. I tore his throat out because he forgot his place. You are standing in my hallway, Cormac, holding naked steel. Are you eager to join him? She is not a mate." Cormac bellowed, his composure cracking under the crushing weight of Rhys's aura. He pointed a thick, gauntleted finger at Maeve. "Look at her. She is trembling. She smells of rot and fear. The moon goddess does not tie kings to fragile, human-blooded refuse. You are bewitched. We are here to excise the rot." Cormac lunged. It wasn't a tactical strike. It was a blind, frantic surge of pure territorial aggression, driven by the desperate need to break the king's unnatural dominance before it broke the remaining council. Maeve flinched, her human reflexes too slow to even register the blur of iron and leather rushing toward her face. She closed her eyes, bracing for the inevitable, tearing impact of the broadsword. The impact never came. A sound like two boulders colliding deafened her. A violent rush of wind ripped through the doorway, carrying the harsh scent of ozone and bruised pine. Maeve snapped her eyes open. Rhys hadn't drawn his sword. He had simply caught Cormac. The Alpha King had stepped forward, his massive left hand wrapped completely around Cormac's armored throat. The Elder's forward momentum was stopped dead. Cormac's broadsword clattered uselessly against the stone, dropping from fingers that suddenly lacked oxygen. Rhys lifted the heavy, armored wolf completely off the floor with one arm. The corridor erupted into chaos. The guards drew their weapons back, roaring in challenge, but the sheer crushing pheromones exploding from Rhys pinned them to the flagstones. It was a physical weight, a suffocating blanket of absolute, ancient authority that bypassed their armor and hit their nervous systems directly. "She is trembling because she is human!" Rhys snarled, his voice dropping into a guttural demonic register that scraped against Maeve's eardrums. He squeezed his fingers. The heavy steel rivets on Cormac's leather collar buckled with a sickening metallic crunch. "She smells of rot because Garrett split her ribs open while you arrogant cowards sat by and drank my cider." Cormac choked, his heavy boots kicking wildly in the empty air. His face turned a deep, mottled purple. He clawed at Rhys's forearm, but his nails merely scraped uselessly against the hardened leather armor. She stepped out of the shadows to face 12 armed warlords. Rhys continued, his voice a lethal rhythmic beat in the frozen corridor. He slowly turned his head, surveying the paralyzed guards and the 3 remaining elders. "My mate has no claws. She has no pack. She has a fever that is boiling her blood, and she still stood against you." Rhys leaned in, bringing his scarred face inches from Cormac's bulging eyes. She has more courage in her weeping stitches than this entire pathetic, posturing council," Rhys whispered. "Now, kneel, or I will crush his windpipe and start on the rest of you." He tossed Cormac away like a sack of spoiled grain. The heavy elder hit the stone wall with a bone-rattling thud and collapsed into a wheezing armored heap, clutching his crushed throat. The silence rushed back in, heavy and ringing. One by one, the elite guards broke. The king's dominance was too absolute, his violence too casual. A massive guard on the left dropped his sword. The iron clanged loudly on the flagstones. He sank to his knees, baring the thick, vulnerable column of his neck. Another followed. Then 2 more. The remaining elders looked at Cormac coughing blood on the floor, looked at the terrifying, flat, yellow eyes of their king, and slowly, bitterly dropped to their knees in the dirty corridor. Maeve stood in the doorway, staring at the sea of bowed heads. Her side burned terribly. She was dizzy, nauseous, and smelled heavily of sweat and old blood. There was no magical transformation. She hadn't suddenly become a powerful werewolf queen. She was still just Maeve, a broken scullery maid in a ruined dress. But as Rhys turned back to her, his massive chest heaving, she realized something fundamentally terrifying. He didn't care. He had just brought the northern packs to their knees not to conquer them, but simply to clear a path so she wouldn't have to hide in a wardrobe. Cold drafts whipped through the high stone corridors. Maeve squeezed her eyes shut. She fought the nausea brought on by the jarring rhythm of his strides. He walked fast, heavy boots echoing off the granite walls, carrying her tight against his chest. She felt every shift of his muscles beneath his thick leather tunic. He was a massive, terrifying furnace, radiating a scent of bruised pine and electricity that made her head swim. She kept her bloody hands clenched against her chest, afraid to ruin him. She was a scullery maid. He was the king. This proximity was a death sentence. They passed through heavy iron doors. The sudden heat was shocking. His private chambers were suffocating, heated by a roaring fire. The air tasted of wood smoke and his lingering, sharp scent. There were no tapestries, just scarred wood and a heavy bed draped in thick furs. Rhys set her down on the mattress. It was stuffed with actual feathers. The sudden yielding softness sent a spike of pure panic through her. Predators didn't offer comfort to prey unless they were fattening them up. "Sit," Rhys commanded. His voice was a harsh rasp. Maeve tried to slide off. "The blood. I'll ruin the pelts." His large hands clamped onto her shoulders. The grip was shockingly restrained. "Let the pelts rot," he growled, pacing toward the fireplace. He looked like a caged animal. The chamber doors banged open. Bram, the packhead healer, stumbled into the room. He smelled heavily of dried herbs, grain alcohol, and unfiltered fear. He took one look at the king and swallowed hard. "Fix her," Rhys ordered, staring into the flames. Bram hurried over. He pulled out a linen towel, grey paste, and an iron needle. "Hold still, girl," he muttered. He pulled the soaked apron away. The crude bandage peeled off with a sickening tear. Maeve bit her lip until she tasted copper. The wound was ugly. The careless swat had ripped the original stitches, leaving jagged, weeping edges. "It is festering." Bram sighed. He uncorked a glass bottle filled with harsh liquid. "This is going to burn." Maeve gripped the mattress. White alcohol. It scorched infection out of deep wounds. She squeezed her eyes shut. Across the room, a low snarl vibrated against the stone. Bram froze. Rhys had turned around. His eyes were entirely black, his lips pulled back, revealing sharp canines. "Careful," Rhys warned. "I have to clean it before I stitch." Bram stammered. "It will cause pain." Rhys crossed the room. He ignored the healer and dropped to one knee beside the bed. He grabbed her right hand. His palm was rough, covered in thick calluses. "Squeeze," he ordered. "Now," Bram muttered. He poured the raw alcohol directly into the open gash. The pain was absolute. It was a roaring fire beneath her ribs. Maeve did not scream. Screaming only brought more beatings. Instead, she inhaled sharply and crushed her fingers around his hand. She squeezed with every ounce of strength her fevered body possessed. Her nails dug deep. Rhys did not flinch. He leaned closer, gripping the back of her neck. He pressed her face into his shoulder, burying her nose into his thick fur. "Breathe," he murmured. "Just breathe into me." The scent of ozone anchored her as the agony tore through her side. She clung to him like a drowning rat. Bram worked quickly, threading the curved iron needle. Every pierce sent fresh shocks of pain. Finally, he tied off the knot, smeared the paste, and wrapped her torso. "Done," he announced. Rhys ordered him out, guarding her. The power dynamics have just shifted permanently, but Maeve is far from safe in a pack that despises weakness. Will her cynical nature let her trust a king who drops to his knees for her? Or will the vicious politics of Oakhaven Keep tear them apart before the bond even sets? If you want to see how Maeve survives the healer's table and the wrath of the elders, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video. Let me know in the comments what you think Rhys will do to the alpha who whipped her.